Thank you guys so much. Well, good morning again. Like they said, I'm Eric. I get to serve on the team here as one of the pastors. I live up north, so I'm not here all the time, but like they said, we're one church in many locations, so it's so great to be with you today. If you're brand new, just want to say this, we love you, and we're so glad that you're here, and if you've been here at SMCC for a long time, you already know that we love you and that we are so glad you're here. Pastor Tom, who you usually hear from on our teaching team, is on a cruise. I talked to him yesterday. He was getting on a plane for Barcelona, Europe, Spain, Italy. I don't know. He didn't take me with him. I'm a little grumpy, but that's where he is. So you'll hear from me today, and then you'll hear from, I think, David next week. And then our founding pastor, Paul Roby, will be with you in the weeks to come. And so that'll take us into our next series together. So really excited about the summer and all that's going on around here. Now let's start by getting real and honest about something that we all do, something certainly we have all done, and we'll pull it up on the screen. You can follow along on the screen or in the notes that you received when you walked in. Here's what we've all done. We've all said we were doing fine when we weren't really doing fine. We've all done this, okay? I mean, your back could be out, the stock market could be down, your pet could be sick, the car, it needs repairs, and your team just lost, and someone would ask you how you're doing, and you would say, doing pretty fine, doing pretty well, doing okay. We've all done this, right? Why do we do this? Why do we do this? I think there's a lot of reasons for why we do this. I do this. We do it because it's not the right place. It's not the right time, or perhaps they're not the right person, or maybe we just don't even know where to start. So someone asks, and we say, we're doing okay. Just don't really want to go into it. I'm fine, trust me, okay? But there's a place where this happens a lot. There's a place where this happens maybe most often. You know where that place is? Here. I don't mean like SMCC St. George. I mean like church, okay? I mean church. You could be fighting with your spouse all weekend, yelling at the kids in the back of the minivan, and when you walk through those doors, something happens. You're like, put it together, everybody. Smile your way through it, okay? How are you doing? I'm fine. We're fine. Kids, don't tell them we're fine. I saw a video recently that illustrated this pretty well. Take a look at the screen.
Come here, look at me. You have to stop crying. Okay?
Yeah.
Come here right now. Look at mommy for a minute. You stop crying right now, okay?
Okay.
Are you crying?
No.
Not any-
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm laughing.
You're happy?
I'm laughing.
Oh yeah, you're laughing.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to watch Sophia?
Yeah.
Okay, no more crying, okay?
I think I'm a little bit tired.
I don't know about those parenting methods, but have you been there before? Perhaps you're there. Perhaps you are there right now. I've been a pastor long enough to know this, that every Sunday there are people that walk through the doors smiling, but on the inside they are just weighed down heavily. And perhaps that's you. And I appreciate what Jesse said. If that's you, you are not alone. You are in good company with so many people around you, and you are in good company with the author of a book that we've been studying for the past 3 weeks. In fact, the reason he wrote the book was to bring us into his own story so that his story would guide our stories. His name is Habakkuk, and his name means to wrestle. And a couple things I want to remind you of before we get into the third and final chapter of Habakkuk's work. I hope we are seeing this together as we've studied, that it's okay to be honest about the fact that you're not okay. It's okay to be honest about the fact that you are not okay. I won't make you do this, but if I were to ask the room to raise a hand, if something's not okay right now, if there's something in your world that you would like to see happen differently, if there's something that you could see going better than it is, whether that's in your own life or in your neighborhood or in your extended family's life or even on the news, I think every hand in the room would go up. And Habakkuk is letting us know it's okay to be honest about the fact that we are not okay. If he were here, he would have both hands up. If Habakkuk were here, this minor prophet, that's what he's called, not because he wasn't a big deal, but because his work is only 3 chapters as compared to Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel in the Old Testament. Habakkuk is considered a minor prophet because it's just 3 chapters. But if he were with us today, he would have both hands up. He would be singing that song, Good Plans, with tears in his eyes because he's going through some heavy things. And we will remind ourselves of those things as we get into the third chapter, just so you know exactly what's happening. But ultimately, I want you to know this. He would want you to know this, that even when you wrestle with God, you are still in his hands. Even when you are wrestling with him, you are still in his hands, which means we can wrestle and still worship him. We can be in anguish and still have joy in him. We can be in the midst of some pain and still praise him. That is the message of the book of Habakkuk. His name, in fact, means wrestler. And so today we're into the third chapter. If you're new to the Bible is broken up into kind of two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And like I said, Habakkuk's a minor prophet. He comes at the tail end of the Old Testament with Zechariah and Haggai and Malachi and these names that are very hard to pronounce, like his, Habakkuk. But there you will find him. His work is so interesting. He's considered a prophet, but a different and interesting type of prophet. In the Old Testament, most often a prophet received a message from God and would speak it to the people. But Habakkuk's a little bit different. Habakkuk is looking at all the pain, all the frustration, all that's going wrong in Israel, and he's taking those observations and he's bringing them to God. And today we are in the third chapter. The third chapter is so special. It's my favorite chapter out of 3. There's not a lot. It's my favorite chapter in the book. And so we're going to get into it now. Habakkuk chapter 3. We'll pull it up on the screen. You can follow along. We're going to look at this very important section of the book. Habakkuk chapter 3, picking it up in verse 1, we see this. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. A prayer now. So we've seen some conversation. We've seen the prophet's plea in chapter 1. We've seen God's response in chapter 2. And now here is his prayer. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth. Everybody say Shigionoth on 3. 1, 2, 3. I don't know if that's how you're supposed to say it, but that's how I'm trying to say it. I'll tell you what Shigionoth means in just a second. It's not like a holiday, okay? On Shigionoth, on 4th of July. No, it's not that. Here's his prayer. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In this moment, in this time, Lord, would you repeat what you've done? Repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Now, one way to think of Habakkuk is to think of Habakkuk as a worship leader, okay? He was a temple musician in Jerusalem in the southern kingdom in Judah. He was a temple musician, and when you think of a worship leader, you might think of skinny jeans and tattoos and beards, Jesse. But Habakkuk was a little bit different, okay? He was a temple musician, which means he was able to put song to the full spectrum, the full range of the human experience. A full spectrum of what it means to be human emotions. And that's who he was. That was his profession. What we see here in chapter 3 is something very specific. Shigionoth should highlight for us how we are to read chapter 3. Shigionoth was a musical term. It tells us how we should read chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a passionate response set to music. Now, we don't know the tune. We don't know how it went. We don't know if it was major chords or minor chords or fast or slow tempo. But it was set to music. Chapter 3 was set to music. Shigionoth is a musical term that denotes the emotion of the moment. It's a chapter that should be read with passion and energy and excitement. You could think of Shigionoth like this. Shigionoth is a Hebrew word for a passionate song of praise. Now, you might be wondering, why does it say Shigionoth? Like, why is that word there? Well, the translators of the Old Testament don't really know a better word in English to use, so they just use the transliterated term, which is what it sounds like in Hebrew. They just write it out in English, okay? So it's transliterated into English. David once used the term in the book of Psalms, okay? Now, it's a bit of an interesting term, but musicians like to use interesting terms anyways. Like today, the young people like to say this when they hear a good song. They say, that song slaps. And I'm like, what? Song slaps, and it just means it's really good or really cool or, I don't know, something like that. I can't keep up. But you get the idea. It's a word that would describe a specific type of music. So Shigionoth is telling us that chapter 3 should be set to music. It should be read with passion and energy and focus, okay? Kind of with someone who's been wrestling, but now read by someone who's willing to worship in the midst of the wrestling. So, chapter 1 was Habakkuk's plea to God. God, do something already. How long, God? How long? How long? Something that we've maybe prayed or thought. And then chapter 2 is God's response. Okay, and his response was, I'm going to do something about what's going on in Israel. I'm going to use the Babylonians to do it. And if you missed weeks 1 and 2, go catch them online. Pastor Tom did an incredible job. Habakkuk says, you're going to use the Babylonians? They are even worse than us. Why would you use them? And we walked through how God is at work in the midst of evil in our world, what he'll do about it. Talked about justice last week. And now we're into chapter 3, and this is Habakkuk's response to God's response to him. Okay? So we've seen the introduction, and it's a prayer. It's a prayer that he prayed for Israel. God, I've heard of your fame. Would you do something in our time? Now, I just want to give you a prayer at this point, a real application that you could pray each day this week with me for our city. If Habakkuk were here, I think he would take this prayer and say, would you put it maybe into your own words, and would you pray it for St. George, Utah? And it would be something like this. God, at this time, show your fame, that Utah would know your name. And if you're like, Eric, that rhymes. I'm like, yes, chapter 3 was a song, remember, okay? God, show your fame, God, that Utah would know your name. What a prayer. This is what Habakkuk is doing here in verses 1 and 2. And every time you show up here, and every time you pray for your church and your leaders, and every time you give, and every time you serve, you are an answer to this prayer. Now, let's keep going, picking it up in verse 3 now. Habakkuk is going to poetically describe God's deeds throughout his history that produce awe, Habakkuk's people's history. Here it is. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. You're like, that doesn't make much sense. What does that mean? Habakkuk's doing something so cool here. He's taking these places that his people would have known, and he's saying, remember what God did there. Remember what God has done in those places. Teman was from the east. It's where the sun would rise, and it's how God led his people from the east out of Egypt in the Exodus. Mount Paran is another way to talk about Sinai. He's going through the photo album, if you will, of God's work throughout Israel's history. On my iPhone, I have the app for Google Photos because my phone gets clogged because I take so many pictures of things. And Google will give me almost every day. It's starting to get annoying, actually. They'll give me about every day, 3 years ago this happened, 1 year ago this happened, 10 years ago. And I'm like addicted to clicking on the pictures because I love to scroll the album through my story. Habakkuk's doing the same with his people's story. He's going to go back through these moments where God's work was clearly on display to remind himself of who God is and what God has done. So let me get through this. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled, and the age-old hills collapsed, but he marches on forever. He marches on forever. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory, saying, God, you have won the battle for us? Picking it up in 13. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear, you pierced his head when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were in hiding. You trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. Habakkuk is taking time to list out the ways in which God has triumphed over Israel's enemies. And at this point in history, it included God's work in and through Israel. But at our point in history, we get to see even more. And so I listed out some things that I think can help us go through the photo album, if you will. Can help us remember what God has done. Here we go. God's work stretches from the stars of creation through wilderness wanderings, upon the waves of the Red Sea, through the smells of a manger, to the sounds of the cross and the shadows of the empty tomb, to the unity of the local church, and into the beauty of eternity. Wow. This is what God has done. And at this point in chapter 3, Habakkuk is going back and reminding himself of who God is. And we can and should do the same. Now we're about halfway through chapter 3. I love this chapter. But first I want to say this. I am a sports guy. I love sports. And I'll be watching like a game. And there's this thing I've been noticing as I've been watching these games, whether it's the NBA playoffs or the Stanley Cup playoffs. I love that. Or whether it's the majors in golf. It's a good time of year to be a sports fan. That's how I feel. And you're like, Eric sounds like he watches a lot of TV. How's his wife doing? But anyways, we're good. We're good. I promise we're good. Anyways, I love watching sports. And here's the thing that I've been noticing is they've been taking the modern day athlete during these games, and they're comparing the athlete back to an athlete from a previous era or a previous time. And I find this pretty interesting. I was watching a hockey game the other day, and they were talking about Wayne Gretzky, the great one, or as my young son used to call him, Wayne Jetski. But they were talking about the great one, and they said this, that he's the all-time points leader, 970 points above the next person in second place. And they said even if Gretzky never scored a goal in his whole career, he would still be the points leader. And I was like, that is incredible. I mean, that's the kind of stat that just brought me into a place of awe and wonder. Here's another one, Scotty Scheffler. As far as I can tell, Scotty Scheffler is an amazing golfer, an incredible human, even if he got arrested wrongfully. I don't know if you saw this, okay? Scheffler, it was quite a deal. But Scheffler's been the world number one for 2 years. He has 11 more years to go, all right, to catch up to Tiger. Okay? I mean, that's just incredible that Tiger was on top for that long. Those type of stats, those type of feats, they bring me to a place where I'm just in awe of greatness. And that's where we find Habakkuk now at this point in the chapter. He is in awe of greatness. But it's an interesting type of awe. It's the kind of awe that then gives way to fear. Not the type of fear that says I'm scared, but the type of fear that says I must humbly submit. So that's what we see next. So as we keep reading in chapter 3, look at what Habakkuk says, picking it up in verse 16 now. It says, I heard and my heart pounded. This is an expression of my heart started to race. God, I got excited, but it was like this heavy type of excitement because what you're going to do through Babylon for the nation of Israel, it's going to be incredibly heavy. So I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. This is a word of kind of like nervous, paying careful attention, watching, but wondering what it's going to be like. Then he says this, decay crept into my bones. It was so heavy for him. Things are about to get incredibly difficult for our people. But God, I know it's a good thing that it happens. He's describing his emotional response. And my legs trembled. If Habakkuk were here and we would say, Habakkuk, how are you doing? I don't think he would say, I'm fine. I'm laughing. I don't think so. I think he would say, I'm a bit of a mess. God's going to act. And I'm so grateful that he's about to act. But this is going to be the heaviest thing we've ever been through. That's what he's describing here. Heart pounded, lips quivered, crept in my bones, my legs trembled. But look at this next part. This is where it gets so incredible. Yet I will wait. Yet I will. This pattern in chapter 3 is so important when it comes to walking with God through difficulty and through suffering. Yet I will. Yet I will. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Then he picks it up in verse 17 through 18. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, there's that word again, that phrase, yet I will. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. Habakkuk, as he describes this, is describing a famine. In an agricultural society, figs meant food, grapes meant celebration, crops meant security, animals meant money. And Habakkuk is saying, that's gone. We are in the midst of a famine. Those things are gone. Yet I will, yet I will. Now, famine is a time of scarcity, and I don't want to undermine real food scarcity and famine. It exists across the world. But I want to talk about a different type of famine, the type of famine that I've noticed in Utah. I've seen some famines that people have gone through, that maybe you're going through, that doesn't include food, but includes some other things. So let me talk about the 5 famines of affluency. These are famines or scarcities that we experience in affluent areas and cultures. The 5 famines of affluency would be these. Economic famine. What I had was gone. I don't have enough. Relational famine. I'm alone. That person is gone. That relationship is lost. Performance famine. I'm not good enough. I thought I'd be further along by now. I got let go from the position. I'm unable to perform like I would want. Emotional famine. I'm numb. My emotions, they're not working correctly. My emotional health is gone. Emotional famine. Or this one, physical famine. I'm not what I once was. I can't do what I want to do. And Habakkuk is saying, even in the midst of this famine that he was experiencing, that he would rejoice. Yet I will rejoice. Yet I will wait. How does he get there? Because I would love to get there as well. Here's what he is doing. He is modeling for us how to worship and wrestle. And it looks like this. When you unhitch your attitude from your circumstances and instead hitch it to God's character, you will always be chained to his goodness. That's the secret that Habakkuk is getting us to. The secret to worshiping in the midst of wrestling is to look at the evidence of God's goodness based on his character, based on the cross, not based on our circumstances. And when you unhitch, when you untether, when you cut yourself free from the worship of your circumstances and connect yourself to God's character, you are now hitched to his goodness, and there is something to rejoice in always. This is what Habakkuk is doing. This is what he is modeling for us. What I'm saying is that what happens to you does not have to dictate what happens in you. It took Habakkuk 3 chapters of pleading and wrestling and emotional frustration and even anger towards God to come to this place. And so he does. And then he gets to the very end of his book, verse 19 of chapter 3, and he says this: "The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights." And here comes the musical wrap-up. For the director of music on my stringed instruments. Nothing had changed on the outside for Habakkuk, but so much has changed on the inside for him. And he has moved from his circumstances dictating who God is to who God is dictating how he sees his circumstances. And it meant everything for him. And so he's strengthened by that. And that is the book of Habakkuk. Now, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament describes the very same process. I want to take you there. Philippians chapter 4, all the way to the New Testament. Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. Paul says this: "I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength." The type of strength that Habakkuk experienced, now Paul is describing as well. He has unhitched his attitude from his circumstances. He's hitched it to God's character, and now he can be content in him. Wow. Habakkuk and the Apostle Paul describing the very same thing that I think we need here and now. So as we bring this series, Habakkuk, the prophet's plea, to a close, I want to just share a couple things. 5 ways to walk with God in the midst of suffering. If you're going through a time where you would say, I am not okay, and things are not just fine, and I've been wrestling with God, here's how we can wrestle and still worship. The first is this: we can recall God's work. That's what Habakkuk did. That's the beginning of chapter 3. Then we can repeat God's truth. We can repeat God's truth. That's what we see in the middle of chapter 3. And then we can respond honestly. That's what Habakkuk did when he says his legs are shaky, he's quivering, it's just so heavy. Okay, that's what he did. He was responding honestly. And then he does this: he rejects the God of circumstance. Circumstance is not the God of his life. And he comes to the very end and he says, well, then I'll rejoice now in God. And that's the end of chapter 3. And in those 5 ways, that's how we can walk with God through suffering. So I want to go back to that pattern, that theme that we saw there. And I want to allow you to fill in the blank. Even though blank, yet I will. Even though this, yet I will. I'm wondering how you would fill that in. As you think about that in your own life, even though blank, yet I will. That's Habakkuk. Even though there's famine, yet I will. Even though the enemy is coming, yet I will. Even though, God, I don't like your timing, yet I will. Even though, God, I don't like your methods, yet I will. How would you fill in those blanks this week? I would just love for you to take some quiet time this afternoon or tomorrow morning, at some point, maybe during your commute, to fill in those blanks. Even though my kids, not the way I'd want it to be, yet I will. Even though my health is here, yet I will. Even though my friends are in this spot, yet I will. Even though the world is in this place, even though America is yet I will. Even though blank, yet I will. That is a pattern for wrestling and still worshiping. That's the message of the book of Habakkuk. Now, I want to wrap up with a story that I heard recently. It's the story of a German pastor who lived about 400 years ago. His name was Martin Ringhart. And Martin Ringhart wrote an incredible hymn, probably one of the most famous hymns of all time. But the thing that's so fascinating about the story of Ringhart is the situation in which he was in when he wrote the hymn. Martin Ringhart was a pastor, was a leader in Eilenburg, Germany during the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, about 400 years ago, 30 Years' War. And during the 30 Years' War, about 10 million of Germany's 16 million people lost their lives. Through plague and war and famine, it was horrific. In the city of Eilenburg, people were eating dead cats and dead crows. I mean, it was an incredibly painful time. And the other pastors in Eilenburg, they either fled or they died. And Martin Ringhart was the last pastor left. And every day, Ringhart performed somewhere around 50 to 60 funerals. Every day. Could you imagine? I can't even respond to that many emails a day, okay? 50 to 60. By the time it was all over, about 5,000 funerals in all, Martin Ringhart officiated over, including that of his very own wife. And then he would lose his life in his early 60s. But it's the hymn that he wrote in the midst of all of that that is so powerful and compelling, absolutely in line with Habakkuk, absolutely in line with what the Apostle Paul said in Philippians 4. Can I read to you a bit of that hymn? Look at this. Now thank we all our God with heart and hands and voices, who wondrous things has done, in whom his world rejoices, whom from our mother's arms has blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today. Oh, may this bounteous God through all our life be near us, with ever joyful hearts and blessed peace to cheer us, to keep us in his grace, and guide us when perplexed, and free us from all ills of this world in the next. Wow. What incredible words. How is all this possible? Well, it's the message of Habakkuk. When God's goodness dictates your response to bad circumstances, rather than bad circumstances dictating your response to God, you will rejoice in suffering. Let's give our lives to the one who is over all of our circumstances. So the bottom line of today's message, and really this series, is this. Even though you wrestle, worship. Even though you wrestle, you can worship. Because remember, even when we wrestle with God, we are still in his hands. Because when you're wrestling with him, he's near. And if you're close enough to push him away, you're close enough to embrace him. And listen, if you are close enough to reject his outstretched hand, well then aren't you close enough to see the scars in them? And let me remind you, we don't look to our circumstances as evidence of God's goodness. We look to his character, we look to the cross. And if we're close enough to push his hands away, we are close enough to see his nail-scarred hands and to know that he is good. So for the rest of your life, if you go through seasons of wrestling, seasons of lament, seasons of pain, seasons of anguish, seasons like Habakkuk was in, would you remember that you can wrestle and you can worship. Because even when you wrestle, you are still in his hands. Now today in the service, we get to do something very specific and very special. Jesus actually wanted to put something in our hands to be reminded of the wrestling that he had done on the cross with sin, Satan, and death for us. On the cross, Jesus was wrestling with the powers of darkness. On the day he came out of the empty tomb, it was clear he was victorious. He had wrestled sin, Satan, and death to the ground, and he was victorious. And as he was moving to the cross, he gave his disciples, and by extension, anybody who would be a disciple of his, including us, two objects or symbols that would help us remember what he has done. Bread, which was a picture of his body broken, and juice, a cup, a picture of his blood poured out. And when we put those things into our hands, and when we receive them into our lives, we're saying, Jesus, we trust you. And even if I'm wrestling, Jesus, I'm still worshiping by receiving these two elements. So I'm going to invite our guest services team to the front right now, and they're going to grab these elements, and they're going to pass them around the room. And you're going to receive two items. And if you're on the fence when it comes to who Jesus is, no pressure to need to take these elements. But if you are a Jesus follower and you want to receive his work into your hands and then into your life symbolically, take these elements, and during this next song, you can eat and drink when you're ready. I will pray for us, and then we will worship. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for this morning and the incredible book of Habakkuk. I think Habakkuk would be a close friend to so many of us who are honestly wrestling and who can honestly say, we're not okay, we're not fine right now. God, I'm grateful that you would include Habakkuk's work in the Bible so that for wrestlers like us, we would have this guide straight from you on how to wrestle, but still how to worship. Even though things might be dark, even though things might not be the way we would want them to be, yet we will worship. Even though we wrestle, yet we will worship. Even though we wait, yet we will worship. God, you're good. We have a reason to have joy today because we are still in your hands. As we receive these symbols into our lives, remind us that symbols point to something bigger than us, that you on the cross wrestled sin, Satan, and death to the ground. That you're victorious. And so we receive these objects, these symbols into our lives as a way of declaring your victory now. It's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.